Welcome everybody to our very first interview here on Model Thinkers, and it's no coincidence that I'm actually introducing Lena Ross, who's someone who Shai and I, when we just started Model Thinkers, we thought of Lena as one of the first people we wanted to interview. So I'll give a quick introduction, then I'll throw over to Lena to introduce herself as well. From my perspective, Lena Ross, I consider her, like a lot of people might see her as a change manager. I see her as an agile change practitioner, and that was one of the appeals of bringing Lena Ross on to do this interview, is that Lena draws from traditional change management, but is not shy in stealing ideas and incorporating ideas from other disciplines, from UX to HCD to all sorts of things. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to get you on, Lena. And obviously you're also the author of Change Management, The Essentials, Hacking for Agile Change, and the Agile Change Playbook. I think that was all of them, yeah? So co-authored, I should say.
Yeah, which was fun too. Yeah.
So Lena, please, what have I left out? What would you like to? How would you sort of represent yourself?
Well, before I start, I wanted to congratulate you and Shai on a fabulous website and a fabulous initiative.
Thank you.
I love using, as you said, I love using a lot of models because my work does draw on a number of practices and disciplines. So, whilst I would call myself a change consultant or change advisor, with my own, I've got my own practice, which is Change Hacks, which is quite focused on supporting change practitioners and helping change practitioners do things a little bit differently in these agile and fast-moving environments. A great deal of my work now is as co-founder of the Agile Change Leadership Institute, and our target audience for that is leaders and helping leaders with an agile mindset and leading differently, because our motto there is different and new ways of working mean different and new ways of thinking and leading and learning and delivering change and leading through change. So as you said in your introduction, my work does draw on a number of disciplines, and I think that's what makes it so exciting and interesting, and probably has great appeal for leaders and practitioners alike. So we use design thinking, we use brain science, we use nudge theory, behavioral economics, lean, agile, obviously, so a range of things. So this is why the models, as the models present themselves, as you and Shai have done them, have been fabulous, just to have them all in the one landing place.
Fantastic.
The people like me that just love to use models to help frame up our learning and what we cover.
Fantastic. And I want to get more into a few things you mentioned there. For like, I want to get more into how you work with leaders. Now, we should say Lena's got a bit of a cough. She's been COVID tested.
I am.
We're doing this recording right now in Melbourne, Australia, where we're down to 0 COVID cases in December of 2020. But yeah, please. It's kind of like, it's terrible that you feel like a criminal when you sneeze or cough these days, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when you're shopping or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you have been tested. So look, what I wanted to get to before we jump into your leadership approaches and the models that you combine, I want to talk a bit about more traditional change management. And in your experience, because obviously that's one of the key disciplines that you draw on, what are some of the key models that are used in that field from more traditional practitioners?
Yeah, look, a lot of traditional practitioners are still using what I call step-by-step models, or models that assume planned change in quite stable environments. And that's not a criticism of the model, but it's more, I think, that we need to think beyond following a step-by-step process and starting to draw on different disciplines to right-size our change approach rather than just ticking the box. Some very common ones that are still being used by change practitioners are probably the ADKAR model, which is how an individual experiences change and how to transition an individual through change, which is awareness, desire, knowledge, and so forth. Some still use like a Kotter approach, which is the 8 steps and a planned model. Now, what some of those approaches tend to miss is there's an assumption that change will be institutionalized or embedded or reinforced at the end of those linear models. And we know now with VUCA and change is changing, nothing is really embedded. It's an ongoing state of change. So it's really more about you land or deliver a change, but then it's about evolving and adaptive and iteratively just that adjusting your business to that. And COVID has really taught us that we can't rely on a planned change model anymore. Sometimes we have to respond very quickly to change rather than plan for it.
Right. So what I'm hearing then is would you say a criticism of yours of those models is that they tend to be focused on a linear, almost waterfall
Mm,
campaign,
yeah.
and it's not designed to be more, what I guess, responsive and iterative? Is that kind of your key criticism?
Yeah, exactly right. And look, some of those models will still have a place if you're in a waterfall environment and you are delivering change, which is quite predictable.
So is that like a systems rollout or something that
Yeah,
is like a
yeah,
one-off kind of thing?
yeah.
Yeah.
So they do have their value in place in some environments and some particular change initiatives.
Hmm.
Largely, though, now we're moving towards less planned change, more iterative change, turbulent change, needing to respond quickly, and also less top down and more co-created. And a lot of those models also rely on an old power or an old hierarchical model where formal power would cascade communications, for example. Whereas
So,
now we can influence differently across and upwards.
right. So with that pretty damning critique of those traditional models, let's call it,
Okay,
Lena.
they can still play a role, but it shouldn't be your only
Oh, well,
go-to.
that's what I was going to ask. Like, when would you use those sorts of models like Cotters or ADCAR and even the Bridges model and so on?
Yeah,
Do you lean on any of them in particular, or?
I think knowledge, for a start, I think knowledge of them is important and awareness of them is important as first principles for a change practitioner and a change leader.
Hmm.
However, it's knowing when to use what. So there might be some aspects of some of those models. For example, communicating a vision is an important part of Cotter's model, which would still have value, but
Hmm.
then you may need to do other things a lot quicker or differently after that and engage people differently. So I think a more contemporary approach to change management is, I use a sushi train metaphor, Aaron, where, on a sushi train, you've got like lots and lots of things like constantly coming out. One of those might be the Cotter model and another one might be, Kanban board. You just have to quickly know, okay, for this particular change initiative, I'll grab that. I don't need those next 6 on the line. I'll grab that and I'll grab that and I'll right size my change effort and activity for this point in time for what I need now.
I must say, I love that metaphor, and you've given us a scary insight into your brain, Lena.
Yeah, it is.
So what I'm hearing is that you're not like dogmatic about the approach of any of those particular traditional models. You tend to use them almost more like a checklist or a reference guide, yeah?
Absolutely. So we have this approach that we talk about in the Agile Change Playbook, which is minimum viable change, which is really work out what your objectives and key results are for that project, engage with your product owner or your scrum master or your senior stakeholders, or whatever you're calling them in your context, work out what those objectives and key results are, and then work backwards with your list of tools, whether it's a sushi train or whatever you're using as a metaphor or a model to get your handle around them, and say, this is what I need to deliver these objectives. And that's minimum viable change. And that's right sizing the change. And that means it might use some aspects of those traditional models. It might use none of them. It might use more contemporary things like Kanban and journey mapping and things like that.
So even that term, minimum viable change, obviously inspired by minimum viable product and kind
Yeah,
of lean,
yeah,
I assume you're thinking of lean thinking.
yeah.
Now let's move away from that traditional change management practitioners and look at some of the ways that you've adopted other methodologies in your practice. What are some of the big inspirations for you? You've sort of
Um,
mentioned a few, but if you were to is it human-centered design? Is it agile? Is it lean? I know they're all kind of linked, but what
yeah.
are your big inspirations?
The ones that I really like a lot and tend to use a lot and seem to fit or work for most change initiatives is drawing on the discipline of human-centered design. So I use journey maps a lot.
Okay.
And the reason I use journey maps a lot is it ticks so many boxes. It can help you get a good vision of the current state.
Hmm.
It engages people, so it invites co-creation very, very early. It ticks a lot of boxes. It gives people permission to talk about thoughts and feelings, where often that forum isn't there. Often when we think about change, we think about what's changing from a process point of view, but we don't really think about how we want our people to think and how we want them to feel, or what they are in fact thinking. So if I use the journey map also for future state mapping, I find it's a really great way to engage people in how they want to feel and think in the future state. So they're starting to imagine themselves in a future state. So you're engaging them at a very emotional level as well as a process or transactional level. And I find that really starts to build empathy. But the thing that it really, really does is it also promotes psychological safety. You're actually saying to them, it's okay for you to talk about how you want to think or how you think or how you want to feel. And I can't think of many other forums in traditional change activity that may give that permission for people to do that.
And do you think that's really fascinating? So you're almost using journey mapping to either preview or explain an experience if you're doing current state or future state.
Yeah.
And you said that one of the key things that you found it useful to do is really bring that empathy and psychological safety. I'm wondering, does journey mapping help do that more so than just traditional persona work, for example?
Oh, persona work does it as well.
Yeah.
I think persona work is very powerful too. I think the journey map just takes it to that next level because they can start to imagine themselves in a future state, whereas a persona is very much about getting to know them. I think it's a different type of empathy. I think the persona is getting yourself into their shoes and understanding things from those different lenses. But once you take it to journey map, you start to unpack more about the feelings and things that are actually happening along the way.
Right. And tell me, are there particular tips? Because everyone kind of applies journey mapping a bit differently. Are there
Yeah.
particular techniques or tips that you would recommend when approaching a journey map?
For a current state journey map, I try and involve as many people as possible, because I think if you've got time to do a current state map, you're getting early engagement as well, and it's quite deep engagement. But if you're doing a current state map, I say to change practitioners, invite your business analysts, because they're typically very focused on the process. That's what they do. They do swim lanes and process mapping, and that's their bread and butter. And sometimes...
Can I ask, do you find that they come from an empathetic point of view though, or do you find that that's something you have to kind of layer on to that kind of engagement?
I think, look, business analysts are interesting because some of them do want to be change practitioners, so do get the people side.
Right.
And some are very, they're business analysts and they're very focused on it. So within the business analyst community, it's very diverse. So I don't like to assume. The reason
we have to be careful here because Shai, my business partner, is actually from a BA background, so we can't bag him out too much.
Yeah. But by inviting them, Aaron, a couple of things happen. They learn that sometimes the process that they think people are following is not the process, in fact, they're following.
Right.
They've worked out workarounds, or they've worked out things to make their life easier. So that's a really good aha moment for them. So what they think is a given, like a current state, is not always the given. But it also opens their eyes to those other two dimensions to a process map, which are the feelings and the thoughts. And then once they can, sometimes they engage in that conversation really well. And I think you can just see a little light bulb go off. And go, oh, okay, I can see why that could be a pain point now.
So I'm really getting that you're really using journey mapping to
Whereas on
capture...
paper in a swim lane.
Yeah, go on, sorry.
No, I was going to say, sometimes you can't see that on a one-dimensional process map.
Yeah.
Because you just assume people are just going from, each step in the process is just being followed without understanding that they might deviate, or why they're deviating or not following your process.
It's sort of what behavioral economics did for economics, isn't it? You're bringing the people back into that process. Like you're looking at it really from a human perspective. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
So tell me, what other models are you using in combination with journey mapping and some of those traditional checklists that you kind of use?
Look, the other one I use a lot, Aaron, is a SCARF model.
Okay, so David Rock's SCARF model.
Yeah. Now the SCARF model is powerful for a lot of reasons too. And one is it's great for leaders to understand. I use that a lot with leaders to understand their personal relationship with change.
Do you want to just quickly, we've got SCARF model on ModelThinkers, but for people who don't want to go and have a look, do you want to quickly give us what are your big takeaways of the SCARF model? Not even just a list, but what are your big takeaways for it?
The SCARF model, which is based on David Rock's work, is really to understand from a human hardwired perspective how we're hardwired to either run away from threat, because we want to avoid threat, it was critical to our survival, and we run towards reward. So humans will do what they can to avoid threat or loss, and they will do what they can to get to reward triggers in their brain. SCARF stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness.
You're good. I haven't memorized that one yet.
That's all right. I use it all the time. I've been
Yeah.
using it for nearly 10 years.
Right.
And what David Rock postulates is that if we feel like we're losing any of those things, so status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, which is our relationship with people, or fairness, we
Yeah.
will go into threat mode. But if we feel like we're gaining or getting something in it, for example, if you get a promotion and your status goes up and you think it's really fair and you're feeling good about yourself, you will go into a reward state and feel quite good, and all the good chemicals are firing up in your brain.
All those endorphins, yeah.
Yeah. So the SCARF model helps us unpack with leaders that those triggers, those 5 triggers, actually vary from people to people. What I may really go in high threat over, say, a status loss, may not be such a big deal for someone who's less hung up on status. So they may be more hung up on relationships.
So it's quite personalized still, yeah?
Yeah. And with leaders, the work we do with leaders is really good, because they explore their own relationship with change. And then when we explore it with their teams, they can see the diversity in those threat triggers. Even within a leadership team, we see diversity in threat triggers. So it helps capture when you see a linear change model, like a Bridges model, for example, or something like a commitment curve like acceptance, and then, or say Kubler-Ross, where you go through denial and bargain and finally through acceptance. That assumes a fairly linear experience with change. But what the SCARF model does is it unpacks the emotions that are taking place. So whilst I may be in denial, it could be because I'm suffering from a fairness threat, and you may be in denial because you're suffering from a relatedness threat. So that's why it's a really good one to understand how people experience change differently. And what leaders can learn from that is, because their threat triggers might be one thing, it's not the same. So what they may postulate as benefits of the change and communicate may not really resonate with their team, because their team have got different triggers.
So do you find when they get more self-awareness and apply the SCARF model to themselves, I would have thought that there might be a tendency for people just to assume that, like, if one element, like status, for example, really resonates with me, that it's going to resonate with my team. How do you make the distinction between self and others? How do you say, well, now you've got to apply the model to your team, and that might look a bit different? Is that a hard shift?
Well, we do an activity with them where we get them to self-rate where they are with a few questions.
Right.
It's not scientific, but it is a start for self-awareness.
Yeah.
And then we say to them, we either run the activity with their team members, or we give them the tools to run the activity with their team members, so they then can see the differences and what the map looks like, if you like. Yep. And then we also brainstorm tips with them on how to reduce threats. So if your team is in high relatedness threat, here's some things you can do so they don't feel so disconnected from the rest of their team.
Nice.
So we do a lot of work around that. But there's 2 key benefits from doing that work with leaders, and in fact with change practitioners or any teams. One is you get that self-awareness. So when you go into threat, you can say, I'm not feeling good about this change because I don't think it's fair. Or you can start to label your feelings, and you can start to label what it is that's making you uncomfortable.
So almost have the language around it, yeah? Like, is that a key part of it, the shared language?
Yeah. So, and that's really powerful too. And the second thing is it helps them build empathy, because then they start to understand that not everyone experiences change like they do.
Right.
So it's the self-awareness and a building empathy tool. Aaron, it's interesting. It's also another one that gives people permission to talk about how they feel. It's another forum.
So it's a whole permission structure built around that too,
yeah? It just creates a safe forum for a conversation that might never take place otherwise.
Yeah, right. And linked to that, and you raised this in the first part of our conversation too, psychological safety obviously is a big theme. Can you tell us a bit about what you see as psychological safety? And it seems to be would I be right in saying it's almost like a foundational model in terms of your approach?
Yes, it is. And it's, and some people some people think it's not a big deal. And often people who don't think it's a big deal are usually the ones who feel safe.
Right.
It's not an issue.
If you've got it, you ignore it, yeah?
Yeah. So it's not an issue. So how can it be real? But psychological safety is about, I would define it as feeling comfortable raising something without fear of being laughed at or, being embarrassed.
Mm.
in a public place like a team meeting. And sometimes there are teams that are not safe within an organisation that will say, this is a safe organisation, we have a good safe culture.
Right.
I think a lot of it is based on the leader and what's modelled by them.
Right. So do you think it's very localized based on that
Can
sort of
be,
particular
yeah.
little pocket?
Yeah, I think it can be. I mean, sometimes it's more systemic,
Mm.
depends on the organisation, but I've definitely seen organisations and spoken with people who say, look, I've worked in this organisation, I felt really safe here, but once I moved to that team, oh no, you know, like, just didn't
Mm.
work for me.
Now, I want to go back to, because one of the things I picked up from talking to you is, you know, your critique of those traditional models as being quite waterfall. And even when the way you were talking about SCARF, one of the benefits of SCARF, you know, it's almost like a conversation, like it's an interplay back and forth. But I found it interesting that the journey map, it's kind of like quite linear. It's quite an experience. I guess it serves a particular purpose. But how do you balance up like taking people on a journey, a linear kind of journey, and trying to have this kind of dynamic interplay with them, which is back and forth, and not feeling like you can just check that box of add car and move on, for example? How do you
Yeah,
balance that sort of like the agile versus the sort of taking people on a bit of a campaign or journey?
yeah. I've never really thought of it like that, but it's a very good question. I think a lot of it is in framing. I mean, when I talk about the journey, I wouldn't even mention that it's a linear thing, or in the language I use, I probably wouldn't say to someone, oh, look, we're not doing a linear approach to change. We're going to take a
Yeah.
more agile approach. It's just what you do. And people come along and they just weigh in on it because they can see that they're involved in it and it's a co-creation activity.
Yeah,
So
right.
I think it's more about the doing and less about the labeling. I don't really put a label around it.
Yeah, you wouldn't use a lot of these models out in you just use them as your practice. Yeah, you don't actually talk about them so much in your
No,
work.
and
Yeah.
I found it's a good question because if I am going into an organization to do something, sometimes it's better. I find it's better to just say, look, we're just going to do an activity with a group to find out how they're feeling and where they think they're at with this process, or how they'd like to see the process moving forward. Because sometimes if you go in and say, I'm going to use a tool from design thinking, it's called a journey map, and there's either the eye roll, like, oh yeah, here we go, design
Yeah,
thinking,
right.
a consultant's coming in, or you know, what do you mean by design thinking? I did a course on that, and you know, this and it's that, and sometimes it's better just to
It's
say,
just too loaded, yeah? So you just
yeah,
take them on the experience rather than the
yeah,
jargon.
so, and I just say, look, let's just experiment with this and see if it works and see what we can find out.
Well, we're coming to the end, and I think that's a really fantastic point to end on, because a lot of when we talk about model thinking, I think it's really interesting with someone like yourself who absorbs the models. You don't have to keep using the terminology so much. It might even be effort for you to bring out those terminology because you've kind of absorbed it more. But yeah, I guess, are there any particular last tips or models that you'd like to point people to that they may not be using right now? And given they come from a range of disciplines, what's the sort of model that's really made a big impact on your life and in your work that you
Look,
want to?
the ones I spoke about are
Oh, wait,
SCARF.
you know what I want to do? I want to ask about one of your models to finish off, because we haven't got there. Like, tell us about one of your models that you
Yeah,
use that you've
yeah,
generated yourself.
yeah, yeah. And there is, I was going to mention that too. Thanks, Sarah. And there is one model that I generated in my first book, which a lot of leaders love because it explains how to build enterprise agility. And what that does is it really reminds leaders of the role that they play in their mindset and behaviours. Because about 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote the book in 2017 and designed the model in 2016. When Agile was starting to make its way into enterprise agility and as a capability and things that leaders had to know, they struggled a little bit with thinking that if they got an Agile coach in or a Scrum Master, which is more like the technical aspect of Agile and the doing or the practice, that they could tick all the boxes. And this helped bring attention to make the leaders accountable in their role in actually building agility in the organisation. So it's been very helpful and a really good way to springboard a lot of the sessions we do with them and to talk about Agile and to get them on the same page.
Is this where the little a versus big A Agile comes into? Do you actually work, do you want to explain that and talk about how you work with different sorts of organizations?
Yeah, I find it's very helpful to explain big A and little a. Some Agile purists will say, look, big A has little a Agile in it, and it is true. But to draw
So
this,
big A is where they're actually implementing like Scrum or Kanban and those
yeah,
sorts of things.
exactly, yeah. You could say big A is the ethos of the Agile Manifesto,
Yep.
and little a is the word agile that we all knew before agile became
Yep.
agility, nimble, quick, responsive. But however, really, big A Agile did have the ethos of little a Agile in it, but because it just took that software development kind of path, that's what they call big A Agile, and then little a Agile is really the mindset, the behaviours, the whole thing. So interestingly, you could almost say big A Agile is a subset of little a.
Yep. Fantastic. And look, we'd love to share. We're going to be sharing links to your model, links to your site and books. And please, how can people best contact you if they do want to engage you for work or other engagements? Yeah.
My website, lenaross.com.au, or connect on LinkedIn and send me a message via LinkedIn or a message via the website. Would love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Lena. I feel like we could geek out about this much longer, and I feel like there'll have to be a part 2 interview later on, but this is a good kickoff. And thank you for being our first interview on ModelThinkers.
Wow, it's a privilege. Thank you for letting me know that that's me. Okay, Aaron. Good luck with
Thank you
everything.
very much, Lena. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye.